Here to provide some insight, Bruce Reinhart. He's former federal prosecutor and co-chair of the White Collar and Government Compliance Practice Group, McDonald Hopkins. Bruce, we welcome you to America's Forum. We thank you for joining us from the Newsmax newsroom.
Well, thank you for having me, JD.
Bruce, this is one of those learning moments for a lot of us. We hear about a grand jury being impaneled. Sir, given your knowledge of the law, could you walk us through what transpires in a grand jury proceeding?
Yes, JD. A grand jury proceeding is a very one-sided and limited proceeding. There's a group of citizens, in Missouri it's 12, and they are impaneled private and in secret. They hear only the evidence that the prosecution chooses to present to them. The rules of evidence don't apply, so whatever the prosecutor wants to present, he can. He has no obligation to present exculpatory evidence, and at the end of the proceeding, the grand jury determines merely whether there is probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed. So it's a limited process for a limited purpose.
Bob McCullough, the prosecutor leading the grand jury proceeding, has a deep history with the St. Louis Police Department. His mother, brother, uncle, and cousin all worked for the department, and his father was killed while responding to a call involving a black suspect. Do you think his history will present an issue today?
I think that's one of the reasons why they are probably impaneling a grand jury. Understand, the grand jury is not legally required in this case. Mr. McCullough could on his own determine there is probable cause to charge someone based on the police's investigation, and he could decide to bring those charges. I think the reason they're impaneling the grand jury is to put some space between Mr. McCullough and his office and that decision, because if the grand jury, which is 12 citizens, returns the charges, it gives him some political cover.
Well, you mentioned political cover, and a lot of us have opined for a long time that politics plays a major role in what happens in the courts. That's just a reality, despite the goal of actually seeing equal justice under law, and that becomes a bone of contention. The grand jury impaneling this proceeding today has a political, I don't want to say political tinge to it, but you said it offers political cover. The grand jury, again, and I want to make sure that we all understand this, the grand jury doesn't decide guilt or innocence, but it decides if someone should be charged with a crime. That's basically the layman's language on this?
That's correct. Their only job is to determine whether charges should be brought, which again, the prosecutor in Missouri has that legal authority to do on his own. He does not have to go through this process. He is doing this for some other reason besides needing to decide if there's probable cause here, and it's my opinion he's doing it because whatever decision the grand jury makes, it gives him some distance from that decision, and it will help, in theory, calm the community whichever way it goes, because it won't be Bob McCullough, friend of police, making this decision. It will be members of the community making this decision.
Bruce, as you were mentioning that, on our screens right now, we had the picture of the officer apparently involved in the shooting. And last night, to have the governor of Missouri make a statement on television about this case in the wording that he used, talking about bringing politics into the case, does Jay Nixon's comment last night essentially ensure that this grand jury will have this officer, Darren Wilson, charged with something? I mean, does the governor weighing in take away any presumption of innocence on the part of Darren Wilson?
It doesn't help. I think it's a problem that the governor said what he said, but I'd like to think we have some confidence that the members of the grand jury will do what they're sworn to do, which is listen to the evidence and decide the evidence. And understand, the evidence they're going to hear and the question they're going to have to decide is whether there's probable cause to believe some crime occurred, be it a murder, be it a battery, an assault, or something. And they're going to be instructed what the law requires to be proven, and then they're going to have to decide whether probable cause exists for those purposes. So I would hope the governor's comments don't affect the outcome, but it doesn't help.
Bruce, if you were prosecuting this case, what do you think is working for and against Mr. Wilson?
What's working for and against Mr. Wilson, what's working for him is that the case is really going to turn on the testimony of a lot of the other police officers who are going to say what happened at the scene and presumably are going to give testimony that's favorable to Mr. Wilson. Presumably some of the people who will be giving testimony to the contrary are not upstanding citizens of the community who are police officers. And so that's going to work in his favor. And he's going to get a good lawyer because the police union usually provides a very good lawyer in these sorts of officer-involved shootings. And I think that grand jurors and regular jurors want to give the benefit of the doubt to the police. They will understand that the police are doing a very difficult job under very difficult circumstances and making snap decisions on the spot, and to be second-guessed after the fact is not fair. That's certainly what his lawyers will argue, and that's what he's got going in his favor.
Bruce, are those circumstances made more difficult for the police and really for everyone involved with the arrival of Attorney General Eric Holder today? We understand that to federalize a case is one thing in terms of bringing the full capabilities of the United States government to bear, but in addition to federalizing the case, does the presence of the Attorney General politicize it even further?
It may, and I think that's a risk that's going on here. I think the reason the Attorney General is there is not anything to do with the case itself, but has to do with trying to calm the community. And what's going on in this process you're seeing right now between the impaneling of the grand jury, the Attorney General being there, and a number of other things, is a decision has been made to prioritize community safety and community calm over the criminal process. And I think the Attorney General being there is going to make the criminal process work differently, but I don't think that anyone cares at this point. I think what they care about is quieting things down in town, making sure there's less violence, making sure that it's safe. And if that affects the criminal process, so be it.
Bruce, there's been a lot of conflicting stories from witnesses on what actually happened that night. But one thing that has been proven to be true is that Brown was shot 6 times. Do you think that works against Wilson? Does that show inexperience?
I think it depends if Wilson is the one who shot him 6 times or whether there are other shots from other officers. I don't know that it matters how many times he was shot. I think if the officer believed in good faith that he was at risk and that he was in danger, he's entitled to do whatever he needs to do to protect himself. So to me, that doesn't make that much of a difference. I think it looks worse for the police officer that he fired that many, but I think that's explainable as a defense lawyer to a jury or to a grand jury.
Bruce, some of the facts of this case have been slow in coming, facts that could aid the case of the police officer. For example, there is the video that came from the convenience store where it appeared Michael Brown was involved both in a robbery and assaulting one of those working in the store. And yesterday we got word that, in fact, Officer Wilson had an orbital fracture, I believe, of his left eye. Now, does this typify what needs to happen in this grand jury process, that all the facts need to be considered? Or, given the notion that it is the grand jury's mission to decide if there's enough evidence to prompt some sort of legal action, will those 2 exculpatory items for the police officer be ignored or de-emphasized with this impaneled grand jury?
Well, as I said earlier, legally, the prosecutor is not required to present exculpatory evidence to the grand jury, but ethically he is. And in my experience, they generally will. Because one thing that a grand jury affords a prosecutor is sort of a dry run of the evidence in the case. You can see how the grand jurors react to it. You can actually have dialogue with the grand jurors during the proceedings. And so it's a good way for you to test out whether certain witnesses and certain evidence are going to be believable and powerful. So I would hope that this evidence would be presented and considered by the grand jury, because it is important, and the prosecutor doesn't want to get snookered that he doesn't present this evidence to the grand jury. He knows that at a real trial it's going to come out, and you go ahead and indict the case and then get bitten by the exculpatory evidence. So I would hope that it would be presented, and I would expect that it would be.
As you mentioned this, Bruce, it's really important that we amplify what you just said about exculpatory evidence. The prosecutor is not required to present it, but ethically he would be compelled to bring it up. That's what you believe. That's been your past experience.
Well, that is correct. That's the law. I mean, the law is that you have no obligation under the Constitution or laws of the United States to present that evidence, but the rules of legal ethics say that a prosecutor may not withhold exculpatory evidence from the finder of fact. So although the law doesn't require it, his ethical obligations as a member of the bar do require it, which is why, and in my experience, it is done, and I would expect it would be done here.
Bruce Reinhart, we thank you on dealing with both the mechanics of what transpires with a grand jury, the realities of this case in Ferguson, Missouri, and yes, some of the political fallout that will be part of it as well. Bruce Reinhart, again, our thanks to you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So you have the take of that former federal prosecutor. It's important to find out what the folks are
Right.
thinking there at home. Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum, and we'll be back following this time out.